Most people imagine the tabernacle as a simple tent in the sand. They're wrong. It was not a makeshift shelter, but a portable sanctuary of precise engineering, precious metals, and carefully woven holiness. An impossible project executed in a barren desert by a people freshly freed from slavery. What followed was less an improvised camp and more a piece of sacred architecture built to a divine blueprint, fashioned by hands God-filled with skill. Today, you're going to see how the tabernacle was truly built, the crafts, the dangers, the ingenuity, and the theology woven through every nail, fold, and stitch. Picture the scene, a ragged nation on the move, their feet still bearing the grit of bondage, the sun baking the sand. Moses has come down from the mountain with instructions. He has not been given a general suggestion, but a pattern, a heavenly model he was to reproduce on earth. That model would demand materials few in the camp could have imagined using properly: pure gold, fine linen dyed deep blue, scarlet, and purple, acacia wood straight and dense, silver sockets cut to fit wooden planks, and delicate inlays set with 12 stones. The complaint that this was impossible is what makes the story extraordinary. The answer is that God called and equipped craftsmen to do what looked humanly impossible. At the center of that commissioning stands Bezalel, son of Uri. The book of Exodus says God put his spirit upon him, skill, intelligence, and knowledge in every kind of craft. Alongside him was Aholiab, sometimes seen in later transcriptions as Olabus. That variation appears in some sources, but the canonical name is Aholiab, and a cohort of all the women skilled of heart. This is crucial. The workforce was not a professional guild, but a newly freed people, many formerly enslaved, who became artisans. Imagine the transformation. Calloused hands that had once been bound to repetitive labor now learned joinery, metallurgy, embroidery, and design. The narrative emphasizes teaching. Bezalel could not simply do everything himself. He was empowered to instruct others. The miracle is not merely a spectacular product, but the remaking of a people into makers. Observe for a moment the way that calling reshaped identity. A woman who had once spun and wove under a taskmaster now sits under a shade, counting threads, pulling a shuttle through linen, and weaving cherubim, winged figures that would adorn the inner curtain. A man who had bent metal for slave chains learns to control fire, turning it into a forge for creating sacred vessels. The story insists that holiness is made by ordinary hands disciplined into extraordinary craft. Now turn to the metalwork, where danger and skill meet. The biblical account repeatedly returns to gold. The lampstand, the pole fittings, the overlay on wood, the mercy seat were all of gold. One verse speaks of a talent of pure gold for the lampstand and its accessories. Ancient units like the talent vary regionally. Scholars generally estimate a talent in this period to be roughly 30 to 35 kilograms, about 66 to 77 pounds. That estimate depends on which ancient measurement is used. So when an ancient text says 1 talent, read it as a substantial lump of precious metal, not a trivial amount. Practical reconstructions suggest the menorah and its fittings could have consumed a large portion of dedicated gold, a thing both monetary and symbolic. Gold has properties that made it prized. It is malleable and ductile, able to be hammered into thin sheets and formed into delicate ornamentation. But to shape gold, even in small quantities, needs heat and control. A cautionary note: some transcriptions record an implausibly low melting point for gold. Gold actually melts around 1064 degrees Celsius, about 1947 degrees Fahrenheit. That's not a gentle glow you achieve with a campfire. That requires concentrated heat and controlled forges. In the Sinai, there were no industrial kilns, but bellows and brick or stone furnaces could focus the flame enough to reach the needed temperatures. Scholars infer that artisans used small, efficient furnaces, clay-lined pits, or makeshift forges fed with charcoal. The charcoal itself matters. Acacia wood, abundant in the region, makes a dense charcoal that burns hot and with relatively low smoke. It's plausible that acacia charcoal enabled higher, cleaner heat than lesser woods. This is an inference from materials and environment rather than a direct archaeological report. Still, imagine bellows pumped by experienced teams, sparks leaping, the hot air singing as molten gold is poured into molds or hammered into sheets. Sparks on a windless night in the desert, the glow reflected on faces bent over work. It was strenuous, hazardous, holy work. The lampstand, the menorah, is a good case study in both artistry and technical difficulty.
The description of the lampstand in Exodus implies a single unified object, with branches and cups flowing from a central shaft, all hammered from a talent of gold beaten into shape. To fashion a complex piece like that from a single mass of gold requires skilled hammering and annealing, heating and cooling the metal to make it workable without cracking. That knowledge would be part craft, part passed-down technique, and part instruction from those God had filled with skill. Even when scholars reconstruct these operations, they emphasize how demanding the work would have been, especially in a non-industrial camp. If metals demanded fire and patience, wood presented its own set of challenges. The Tabernacle's framework was made of acacia wood, chosen for its straight grain, resistance to rot, and availability in the region. Exodus specifies boards of acacia 10 cubits long and 1.5 cubits wide. Translating cubits to modern measures involves approximation, but a common estimate places 10 cubits at roughly 4.5 meters, about 15 feet.
That's a long plank. Long, straight, and true in a land that lacked millstone infrastructure. The planks had to be worked to precise tolerances, smoothed, overlaid with gold, and fitted into silver sockets. The sockets themselves, each a base of refined silver, functioned as portable footings, a brilliant solution for a structure that needed to be stable yet repeatedly assembled and disassembled. Imagine the stage of assembly, a line of silver bases sunk into the sand where the tent would stand, boards lifted and slid into those bases, held upright like ribs. 5 crossbars would be slid through rings from the outside, effectively locking the boards together in a rigid framework. This kind of modular engineering makes the tabernacle less a tent and more a prefabricated structure designed for mobility and durability. It was a system that allowed a house of God to travel for 40 years without collapsing under repeated handling. That speaks to both practical ingenuity and to the precise instructions Moses received about dimensions and fittings. The text insists they followed the pattern exactly, as if reproducing a heavenly prototype. The interior fabrics are where artistry meets theology. Women skilled in textile work produced curtains of fine linen, woven with cherubim, and veils dyed in blue, purple, and scarlet. The colors matter. Tyrian purple and cinnabar-like scarlet were costly dyes in the ancient Near East, typically produced from shellfish extracts or insect-based dyes, or sourced through trade with Phoenician centers, or taken as spoil from Egypt. The Exodus account lists these colors among the materials brought by the people, and scholars reasonably infer that many of the most precious fibers and dyes were either spoils of Egypt or acquired through trade networks. Those colors were not mere luxury, they visually signified holiness. The inner space was saturated with hues that communicated otherness, a place set apart. The weaving itself demanded mathematical planning. The veil that separated the holy place from the most holy had to be a continuous, dense fabric, strong enough to withstand handling and to display intricate imagery of cherubim. The weavers would have counted threads, planned patterns, and worked to keep tensions even so that panels matched and seams aligned. That work required both creativity and disciplined, repeatable technique, the same union of beauty and precision that marked the metalwork and joinery. Alongside the fabrics, the priestly garments translate theology into wearable theology. The high priest's breastplate, the breastpiece of judgment, bore 12 stones, each representing a tribe of Israel. The breastplate was fastened with gold chains and settings that allowed the stones to be seen and felt. The high priest's robe had bells and pomegranates on its hem. The sound of the bells would announce his movement within the sanctuary, a mingling of function and symbolism. The gold plate on the turban, inscribed with "Holy to the Lord," in some translations, "Sanctified to the Lord," served as a constant reminder of separation and consecration. These garments were not mere ornamentation. The biblical text underscores their protective and mediating function. The priest's attire set him apart as the one who could approach, in ritual and representation, the presence of God. In a theological sense, they functioned as life-saving equipment, not of the modern medical kind, but as prescribed gear that mediated access to the divine presence and conveyed the gravity of that role. Every piece of furniture, the Ark of the Covenant, the table of showbread, the lampstand, the altar of incense, had both a practical side and a symbolic face. The Ark, with its mercy seat and cherubim, was the focal point, the place where God's presence would dwell. Its construction involved skillful carpentry and careful overlay with gold. The mercy seat's 2 cherubim were molded, likely hammered or fashioned, and attached to the lid. The wood base, the gold overlay, the fitting of rings and poles for carrying,
All of these were executed with an eye to both durability and ritual requirement. The ark had to be portable. The poles were never to be removed from their rings, so the means of carrying the most sacred object demanded engineering that preserved sanctity while permitting mobility. As the artisans worked, teaching one another, as bellows breathed and the shuttle sailed, there was a rhythm. The people gave willingly, the skilled taught, and the community's offerings were transformed into a dwelling for God. Exodus stresses the voluntary nature of the contributions and the excellence of the workmanship. That voluntary zeal was itself part of the theology. A people who had received deliverance now give back their best. The narrative frames the tabernacle as the fruit of devotion and a sign that God's presence has a home among them. Consider the logistical feat of assembly on the appointed day. Scripture reports that on the first day of the first month of the second year after the Exodus, the tabernacle was erected. Imagine the precision required. The bases placed, the planks inserted and braced, the crossbars fitted, the curtains laid over in the right order, the veil hung, the furnishings set in their proper places. The work that took many hands over months had to come together with synchrony. Then, in the culmination recorded in Exodus, the cloud descends and the glory of the Lord fills the tabernacle. This is the theological climax. The structure, built to pattern and beautified by human hands, receives divine approval. The cloud's descent is not merely a dramatic flourish. It is the validation that what had been assembled is now a fitting dwelling for the one who gave the design. There is a tension throughout the account between the dangers of approaching God and the accessibility given through mediated holiness.
The materials themselves reinforce this. Gold warns of splendor and peril. The veil marks separation. The priestly garments protect and signify. The people are taught to approach rightly. The tabernacle's design guards against the casual. That theological architecture insists that holiness is not sentimental but serious. It both attracts and warns. All along, the text and the likely reconstructions preserve humility before sure claims. Where modern commentators and archaeologists suggest how furnaces might have been built, how colors were obtained, or how large a talent weighs, these are reconstructions supported by comparative evidence, not archaeological certainties dug from Sinai. For example, when a modern transcription mistakenly lists an implausible melting temperature for gold, the safer route is to acknowledge the error and give the standard material fact. Gold melts at about 1064 degrees Celsius, so the work of these ancient smiths required intense controlled heat. Similarly, when we say a talent could equal roughly 30 to 35 kilograms, we mean scholars estimate it based on regional measures. That intellectual modesty preserves the awe without pretending archaeologists have all the answers. The tabernacle's mobility is also a theological lesson. For 40 years, as the cloud rose and fell, the tabernacle moved with the people. Its modular design, silver sockets that could hold the boards, crossbars that kept the sides rigid, poles inserted through rings for carrying, allowed a sacred center to travel over the Sinai, a physical reminder that God's presence does not require a fixed temple. This mobility was formative. It taught Israel that holiness accompanied them, that God could dwell in motion with them, and that the sanctuary was both provisional and prophetic. Provisional because it was temporary, prophetic because it foretold an ultimate permanent dwelling. That prophetic aspect points forward. The tabernacle is a prototype for the temple. Its elements, the holy place, the most holy place, the ark, the priestly mediation, become the conceptual architecture for later cultic worship. But the tabernacle's portability and the rawness of its materials also teach something unique. Holiness can begin in the provisional, built by people remade for their task, and grow into a lasting expression when history and covenant unfold. In this way, the tabernacle is both a completed work of worship and a living lesson about transformation. We should pause to honor the ordinary, skillful hands behind the sacred objects. The narrative emphasizes teaching, apprenticeship, and community contribution. Bezalel was filled with the spirit to design and to teach. Oholiab assisted and keyed in the knowledge of carving and sewing. All the women skilled of heart wove, embroidered, and set colors. Their combined effort transformed raw materials into a coherent, mobile house for God, a structure whose completion culminated in the visible sign of divine acceptance. And the last word of the construction narrative is not simply human applause, but divine presence. When the cloud covered the tent of meeting and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle, it was not only a spectacle, but a seal. What had been made rightly was now inhabited. The work became worship. The craft, the teaching, the danger, and the obedience were validated not by onlookers, but by the steady, sober descent of the divine cloud. If you want to follow a full series that unpacks these details, the metallurgy, the woodwork, the textiles, and the theological meaning, subscribe now and we'll walk through each workshop and tent flap in turn. There are questions that still animate study and imagination. How exactly were the furnaces built? What was the step-by-step process to overlay acacia with gold so it would not flake? Where did the dyes come from, and how were patterns kept consistent across panels of cloth? Scholars offer plausible models drawn from ancient Near Eastern craft techniques, comparative archaeology, and textual close reading. None of these models claims to be an archaeological certainty for the Sinai camp. They are reconstructions that help us imagine the skill and labor involved. The important theological claim remains untouched. A people who had been oppressed were remade into a community that could host God's presence, and that remaking required practical skill as much as divine enablement. To return briefly to particular features that encapsulate the tabernacle's character, the silver sockets are a masterstroke of mobile engineering, simple in idea yet profound in impact. They let a fragile construction stand firm without permanent foundations. The crossbars locked the sides together and distributed stress during travel. The overlaying of gold on acacia boards converted common wood into a sacred surface, a visible sign that ordinary matter could be consecrated. The woven cherubim on the inner curtains hinted at the heavenly throne room imagery that undergirds Israel's vision of God, and the priestly vestments made liturgy tangible, a walking sermon in stitched form. Each element was simultaneously technical and theological. Finally, do not miss the human lesson. The tabernacle story is not only about metal and cloth, it is about what God does with people. He calls craftsmen, fills them to teach, and transforms a former identity of servitude into a vocation of sacred service. The desert furnace and the loom become instruments in a redemptive process. That is why the cloud's descent matters so much. It proves that this labor of love, this painstaking obedience to a pattern not of their making, is received. God dwelt among them, not because of their perfection, but because of their faithfulness to the pattern and their willingness to be formed.
If this stirred questions about specific techniques, the tempering of metal, the dimensions of boards in modern measures, or where the dyes were likely sourced, we'll tackle those in the next episode, where we trace the tabernacle's elements from their desert origins to their echoes in Solomon's temple. Watch the next video to see how this mobile tent became the permanent temple. Subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss it.